Okay, let's get started. Welcome to the workshop on economic forecasting in time of COVID-19. So my name is Simon Shen, Associate Professor of Economics at American University. I'm the host for today's workshop. This event is being recorded. Live captioning will be provided throughout the workshop. You can interact with the panelists through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. The questions will be collected and answered at the end of each presentation. Now, it's my great pleasure to welcome Max Friedman, Dean, College of Arts and Science at American University, to give opening remarks.
Hello, I'm Max Friedman, Interim Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at American University. And I'd like to welcome you all to this 26th workshop and the first virtual one of the International Institute of Forecasters. Your presentations and discussions are being live streamed around the globe at a time when the world's health and economic stability are in danger like we have never witnessed before. The title of this conference is Economic Forecasting in Times of COVID-19. The science of modeling and forecasting thrown into disarray by a pandemic that snowballed into an economic emergency, a convergence of crises and a level of uncertainty that had never in our lifetimes factored so much into the equations that drive economic research. This gathering has a wildly unpredictable new component to consider, a kind of genetic mutation that challenges you to produce measurements, models, and testing in a world that has suddenly become untethered from past assumptions, not only by a virus, but by governments and central banks reinventing the rulebook on fiscal and monetary policy, and public health measures vitally needed, but sending business activity into artificial decline. We don't know whether assume a vaccine will be the new assume a can opener punchline to a sad joke, or more hopefully, will reflect a near-term reality that makes possible our emergence into a more normal new normal. The work that you do here, the assumptions you challenge, the ways you factor in the massive shock of this pandemic might well contribute to a beneficial path forward. You will be debating how epidemics drive economic decisions, how to forecast accurately with a wild card throwing everything off, lessons we may learn from history, and what the long-term economic consequences might be. You will debate and answer key questions. What data can you trust? What are the policies needed to help the world economy recover? What does all your research mean for individuals who live at ground level, prisoners of microeconomics who can see no end in sight? The novelist George Eliot called prophecy the most gratuitous form of mistake. But Eliot, who in real life was a woman who defied the predictions and expectations of her gender in order to speak truth, wasn't entirely correct on that one. Your work of prediction and prophecy is essential to the well-being of people everywhere in our uncertain future. I'd like to thank the IIF for hosting this conference at American University, the workshop organizers, Laurent Ferrara, Professor of International Economics at the School of Knowledge Economy and Management, and Simon Shen, Associate Professor of Economics at American University, as well as Chelsea Anderson of AU, who made this all happen online. Thank you all for joining in and debating these issues so critical for our time.
Thank you, Dean Friedman, for giving such a great introduction. Just a reminder, this event is being recorded. Live captioning will be available throughout the workshop. You can always interact with the panelists throughout the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. With that said, let's kick off today's first speaker with Todd Clark, Cleveland Fed. Todd, Please share your screen. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Simon. Okay, everybody can see that then? So let me echo Dean Friedman
Yes.
in thanking Simon and Laurent for organizing the program, and also Chelsea and the team for making it all happen. I'm delighted to be part of it. This is joint work with Andrea Carrero and Massimiliano Marcelino. I think Massimiliano is on the line. And at the outset, I have to the views I'm going to describe do not necessarily represent the views of the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland or the Federal Reserve System. So I'll be quick in setting this up. We're motivated by the literatures on nowcasting and the more recent literature on assessing tail risk to GDP growth, rapidly growing literature. And we're also motivated by the timeliness challenges highlighted by the COVID-19 pandemic. So what we do in this paper is assess the ability of models to accurately nowcast tail risk to GDP growth with a potentially large information set. Partly motivated by COVID-19, we're particularly interested in timeliness. So we're going to consider weekly forecast updating using both monthly and weekly indicators of economic and financial conditions. So we have a large set of indicators, monthly and weekly. We have to deal with the mixed frequency aspects of monthly, weekly, daily data. We opt for simplicity. We're going to use what's known as a blocking approach that we used in our prior paper on nowcasting that was focused on point and density forecasts. So with this blocking setup, for example, with a monthly variable, we have 3 months of the quarter. We form a different quarterly variable containing each of those monthly observations separately. And then what we do is, at the time the forecast is constructed, we put on the right-hand side of the prediction model the quarterly series that we have a current quarterly observation for that particular month. So if we're at the point in the quarter where month 1 is available, what's on the right-hand side is a quarterly variable with just month 1. If we have month 2, then we add another variable with month 2, and so on. And weekly indicators are handled in a similar kind of way. So what that's going to mean is, between having a large set of indicators to start with and then this blocking approach, we have quite large information sets that we're trying to accommodate with these models. So we consider a range of approaches to managing that large information set for the purpose of nowcasting tail risk. So one approach is Bayesian shrinkage. Another will be reducing the dimension of the predictor set using factors. And then we'll also consider forecast averaging of smaller models as a way of managing the large information set. And with our interest in tail risk, we're going to consider both conventional regression, predictions of tail risk, as well as quantile regression, which has become common in this tail risk literature. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to get right into it. I'll start by walking through the data, our models and our methods, forecast metrics, and then results. And then with the results, I'll spend more of my time on assessing the historical accuracy of the prediction approaches we consider. But then I'll also look at case studies of the first quarter and second quarter of this year, as the pandemic was quickly changing the picture, to see how our models and methods performed and captured that. Okay, so again, motivated by COVID and how quickly things changed, we want high frequency. So we're going to consider a weekly forecast calendar. So we have a total of 15 weeks for each quarter for which we form forecasts. So that reflects 4 weeks for each month of the quarter, plus the first 3 weeks of the following quarter before the prior quarter's GDP release has been, initial estimate has been released. We simplify things by treating the timing as being end of the week. So it was 15 weeks, but the end of each of those 15 weeks. And then for every indicator we consider, we assign it a typical release week or availability week in the way that we think about it, based on the historical schedule for publishing that indicator. And then the problem is then to, at each week, forecast GDP growth in that quarter with information available as of the given week of that quarter, or in the last 3 weeks, the next quarter. Okay, so then we are going to consider a number of variable sets. So we start with a set of base macro, what we consider a base macro set of indicators, we'll call base M. So these are the major monthly indicators that either feed into GDP or reflect the business cycle. So employment, industrial production, retail sales, housing starts, and a purchasing managers index for the manufacturing sector. We've chosen these also in part based on their timeliness. And then in the base macro set, we have one weekly indicator, which is initial claims for unemployment insurance. We'll also consider a set of base financial indicators, or base F, which are all going to be available at a weekly frequency. So one is we denote the NFCI, which is the Chicago Fed's Index of National Financial Conditions. And then we'll consider returns on the S&P 500, a term spread, and a credit spread. And then all these variables are commonly used to forecast or nowcast output. I won't be able to cover all the results today. One subset we consider is just using the NFCI in addition to macro indicators, because the NFCI is something that's been commonly used in the tail risk literature recently. But in the interest of time, I'll skip over those results. Then we're also going to consider a set of other weekly indicators of economic activity. And for these, we draw on the set of indicators that go into the weekly index of economic activity that's created by Lewis, Mertens, and Stock, and has been published by the New York Fed on a weekly basis for the past couple of months. And we're going to break it into a small set and a large set based on data availability. So we're going to have a small set of weekly indicators that have data back to 1987 for us. So that will be continuing claims for unemployment insurance, a measure of consumer confidence, steel production, and electric utility output. And then we'll also consider a large set of weekly indicators that's the same small set plus a few others for which data don't start until the 1990s. So those will be loadings of railroad cars, total fuel sales, and retail sales from a source known in the US as Red Book. To the extent possible, we're going to base our results on real-time data. So some of our data are not revised. Other parts of the data are. For the ones that are revised that we can get real-time data for, we use real-time data. So that would be GDP growth, employment, industrial production, housing starts, retail sales. And then in evaluating our forecast, we're going to use the second available estimate from the Philadelphia Fed's real-time data set for macroeconomists. Okay, and then for samples, it's all dictated by the availability of the indicators we're using. So for the base macro, base finance variables, we're able to start estimation in 1970 or 1971, and we evaluate tail risk nowcast starting in 1985 and going through most of 2019. When we consider the small set of weekly activity indicators, those data don't allow us to start estimation until 1987. And in that case, we use an evaluation sample of 2000 to 2019. And then when we go to the large set of weekly indicators, some of those don't start until 1996. And in that case, we have a quite short evaluation sample starting in 2007. In the interest of time, I'll skip over those results today. Okay, for models and the methods, since you're all looking at the slides, T is going to denote the quarter. W is going to be the week of the quarter. And again, there are 15 of those for each quarter. We denote as XW the available predictors at the time the forecast is formed for week W. So this set of indicators for every model is going to include a constant, a lag of GDP growth, and then the monthly and weekly indicators available as of that week for the set that we're looking at. So for each week W, we have a different X sub W, and then X sub W is also going to differ depending on whether we're looking at the base macro finance, adding in the small indicators, small economic indicators, etc. Okay, so let me start with get into the models. So we start with a couple of approaches that rely on allowing a potentially large set of indicators, but using Bayesian shrinkage to manage that. So the first such approach we consider is a simple regression with stochastic volatility. We refer to this based on our earlier work as a BMF model. So it's Bayesian mixed frequency model, simple one that has stochastic volatility. We estimate it by Bayesian methods and then get the nowcast quantiles from just from the posterior predictive distributions. So it's simple to get the things we're interested in through those simulated draws. We'll also consider quantile regression estimated with Bayesian methods. So for quantile regression, there's statisticians have worked out a Bayesian equivalent that relies on, for the error term, an asymmetric Laplace distribution. With that distribution, it's shown that the Bayesian estimator is equivalent to a quantile regression. Then that model ends up being represented using a mixture representation of the error term. I haven't written it out here on the slides, but it's written as a quantile regression. There's a mixture term that floats around once you get into actually working through the estimation. So this case, we take for each week, we put the full set of variables X sub W on the right-hand side, estimate a regression at quantile tau, 5%, 10%, et cetera. We use a Gibbs sampler to get the posterior mean estimate of the coefficient vector, and then the quantile nowcast is then x times that coefficient estimate. We also consider simple quantile regression. One approach would be to use the same basic regression, put all of X sub W on the right-hand side, estimate a quantile regression. And we actually do that, but it turns out to perform very unevenly across variable sets, fitting. With quantile regression, you need to have a small set of regressors on the right-hand side. Some of our models are quite large, and it often doesn't perform very well. So what we do instead in the quantile regression results I'm going to show you is put in one indicator at a time and then average predictions across those indicators. So for our quantile regression approach, shown in next to bottom line of the slide, we put on the right-hand side a constant of GDP growth, and then one of the weekly or monthly indicators of X sub W, estimate that particular quantile model. We do it for all the components of X sub W, and then average them to get what we call the quantile regression nowcast. So those are shrinkage approaches, quantile regression. We also consider some factor-based approaches to dimension reduction. So one such approach we call the BQR, for Bayesian quantile regression, with a factor. So for each week, we take the available monthly and weekly indicators in X sub W, and we use principal components to estimate 3 common factors. And then what we do is for each quantile of tau, we put the factors and a constant and lagged GDP growth on the right-hand side, and use Bayesian quantile regression to estimate the coefficients and form a nowcast. Now that approach, the factors are formed without regard to the fact that we're interested in tails. There are some approaches out there that try and tailor the factor extraction to the interest in quantiles. One approach, due to Giglio, Kelly, and Pruitt, which we follow, is known as what they label partial quantile regression, and they characterize it as adapting partial least squares to a quantile regression framework. So what we do is for each forecast origin, each week W, and quantile tau, we use the Giglio-Kelly-Pruitt method to estimate a single factor F from the monthly and weekly indicators of X. And that involves using quantile regression step to get the factor. And then we take that single factor, put it on the right-hand side, with a constant and lag GDP growth and estimate that model by quantile regression and get the prediction from that. And then we also consider, again, as I mentioned, several different average approaches to deal with a large dimension of the prediction problem here. So we'll look at averaging all the forecasts that we produce, which we'll call all. We'll also look at taking a single variable set. So we use the base macro finance variable set. And then for all the different models we use to produce forecasts for that variable set, we average all of those model forecasts. And then we'll instead take a single model. We use the Bayesian mixed frequency stochastic volatility model and average forecast across data sets for that model's forecast. Okay. And then we consider in the paper a number of other approaches. I will skip over in the interest of time. So for example, we have a quantile regression MIDAS framework that we consider, that'll be discussed in a presentation later today. But in the interest of time, I will skip over that today. Okay, so just to make clear the way that variables enter the model. So there are lots of choices and potentially lots of variables and time transformations that could go into this. We make some choices meant to simplify things and reduce the scale somewhat. And it's basically informed by giving priority to monthly information and using simple averages where we can. So for example, with the weekly variables on unemployment claims and the financial variables, so we have monthly data and weekly data. Within the quarter, once a full month is available, we use that full month average in the model. We don't use weekly observations from that same month. We only use the weekly observations that are past a complete month. And then once we are using weekly averages past a complete month, we average across the weeks and not try and put in each week's reading. So again, general use monthly when we can, and take averages that approximate what we're doing with monthly when we have a full month. So as a concrete example with a term spread, at the end of the third week of a month, we have readings on the term spread for weeks 1 through 3. What we put in the model is not each week, but rather the 3-week average in the model. And then once the month is complete, we drop the weeks and we go to the month average. This is not something we arrived at by checking results. It's a choice we made up front to simplify things. For our other week indicators of economic activity, most of these are 52-week % changes. So we only include in the model a single weekly reading that's the most recent available for that quarter. And the reason for that is just it's a 52-week change. From week to week, there's a lot of overlap. So we avoid the overlap and just use one. Okay, so as an example, consider the variables and model that we would have models available at week 10 of the quarter. So in week 10, for our base macro set of indicators, we have a constant, a lag of GDP growth. We have variables separately for months 1 and months 2 of employment, the ISM, retail sales. For industrial production and housing starts, we only have 1 month of data. For new claims on unemployment insurance, we have readings on month 1, month 2, and then week 9 of the quarter. And then for our financial variables that are in the second row for the week 10 entry, for stock prices, the term spread, and the credit spread, we have separate readings for month 1, month 2. We take an average of the readings for week 9 and week 10. And then for the small weekly set of variables that are in the last row of the table, for sentiment, steel, and utility production, we have a week 9 reading available. Most of these cases, these are 52% week changes. We just put in the week 9 reading. Okay. And then briefly, forecast metrics. I'm going to focus the presentation today on the 5% tail, and our basic measure of accuracy is the quantile score, or what's often known as the tick loss function. We have some other results in the paper, but I'll skip over those in the interest of time. And then I'll show in the table indicators. These come from Diebold-Mariano tests. Okay, so let me just start by a basic pattern. So everyone's familiar with, of course, point forecast accuracy and root mean squared error. That's not the point of our paper, but everybody's familiar with it. Just to establish how things evolve across the week of the quarter, we take a basic model, so the Bayesian mixed frequency model with stochastic volatility. We use our smallest variable set, the base macro variable set, and we consider how forecast accuracy evolves across the weeks of the quarter. And everything is normalized relative to week 1 in this chart. So you can see in the black line, the root mean squared error accuracy of the point forecast steadily improves across the quarter. In total, root mean squared error improves by more than 20% over the 15 weeks that we look at. The blue line, the quantile score, has a similar pattern to it. In total, the tail risk accuracy over the course of the quarter is improving about 25%. So point here is that across weeks of the quarter, adding more current information is helpful to the nowcast, which you would hope to be the case. We think that's the case. This confirms that. And I know I'm getting close to running out of time, so I'll wrap things up quickly here. So this table provides our basic results. So we take as a benchmark our quantile regression approach with the base macro set of indicators. And then for each model, we report in the table the ratio of the quantile score at 5% for that model relative to the baseline. So a number less than 1 means that the model and variable set indicated in the row is improving on the accuracy of the quantile regression base macro baseline. So the first couple of rows show a couple of different models using the base macro variable set. The next several rows show model results for the base macro finance combination set. And then the last few rows are a few different average forecasts. And we, of course, don't show all weeks in the table. You wouldn't be able to see that. So you see there are lots of numbers below 1, commonly of 0.7 or even as low as about 0.6. So we're getting gains of 25, 30% over the quantile regression baseline. So quantile regression is easy to beat. Other key point is accuracy improves as we add data. So I've already made the point that accuracy improves across weeks. The ratios here don't show that, but the levels I showed a second ago do. It's also the case that adding more variables in the sense of adding financials to the base macro set helps improve the tail risk nowcast. For models, quantile regression and quantile regression modius, which are not in the table, perform relatively poorly. Several of the models that use either shrinkage or a factor structure to dimension reduction are better, and several of those approaches are pretty comparable. And then the last point is averaging can also give you pretty sizable comparable gains in accuracy. So if we rank all of our forecasts by their quantile score ratio, the model comes out with the best average. So the approach that comes out with the best average is taking an average of all the forecasts using the base macro finance variable set, which is the one in red there. Okay, and then when we go to the variable set the sample that allows us to consider the small weekly set of indicators, we're not able to start model estimation until 1987. So we shortened the evaluation sample to start in 2000. The basic pattern is similar. Quantile regression is easy to beat. Adding more indicators helps when you're talking about finance. Adding the small weekly set of indicators doesn't really help or doesn't really harm. There's a bigger payoff to having the finance indicators in there. Adding the small weekly doesn't really help if you're only looking for starting from the base macro set. It doesn't hurt if you already have the financial indicators in there. So let me just wrap up with the 2020 Q1 and 2020 Q2 examples. So this slide shows you on the left-hand side the evolution of nowcast across weeks for 2020 Q1, and the right side is 2020 Q2. Again, across weeks. So these were produced, the left-hand side produced these results using data available in late April, and the right-hand side with data available about the third week of June. And we're showing here not everything, just forecasts for a few variable sets, a few of the better performing models. You see that in 2020 Q1, the models weren't really picking up any decline in economic activity until really we got until the end of March, basically. But that reflects the fact that although financials started to turn down in mid to late February, it took a while for hard economic activity indicators to show it. And then once the decline started, it happened really rapidly. The models are kind of similar. The variable sets are kind of similar. 2020 Q2, the nowcasts were quite negative from the very beginning. They eventually got worse around the middle of the quarter. There's some heterogeneity across variable sets, some heterogeneity across models, but they're basically giving you the similar ugly picture. So punchlines, just quickly wrap up. Our results indicate that more information does help with tail risk nowcasting. That's information across the week's quarter. It's also using financial indicators along with macro indicators. Weekly indicators of economic activity don't seem to help, may not, but they don't harm. Maybe as we get longer data sets, that they'll help more. And then finally on models, shrinkage, variable reduction, forecast averaging all seem to have some payoff. No huge reason to prefer one over the other. They all beat quantile regression. So with apologies for running long, I'll stop there and be happy to take any questions anybody might have.
Okay, great timing. Thanks, Tar. Now the floor is open for questions.
Yes, Simon.
Yeah,
maybe I can jump in to start the debate. So hi, hello to all, and thanks, Todd, for this very clear presentation. So I was a bit surprised by the fact that weekly variables are in fact neutral. They do not harm, they do not help. This is what you said. And this is a bit at odds with the recent result that we have, especially around the COVID period, showing that using weekly data are indeed very useful. So is there any reason behind? Maybe this may be due perhaps to the way you handle data before entering the model, because having dealt with weekly data, I know that they have a lot of noise, a lot of outliers, seasonality can be complex, etc. So any insight on this?
So I'd say, just to clarify on the weekly, so weekly information in the financial set definitely helps. And weekly, we do have weekly economic claims, those may help. It's this, the ones where we have trouble finding clearly that they help are the ones for which the estimation sample's kind of short, so 1987. So, it could be that as we get longer samples and are able to estimate models more precisely, there'll be more of a payoff, or more clearly a payoff. So, I mean, we can investigate more of the transformation question, but I suspect part of it is just, the estimation samples are short, and as you know, parsimony is really crucial. But we did make choices on the transformations. We followed the Lewis et al. Approach, but it is something we can investigate.
Great. Any other questions? Hey, Kadro, you are muted. Please unmute yourself. Good.
Great presentation, Todd. I have one very simple question. That suppose you're using weekly data or daily data and so on. Let's also hear from you, the horse's mouth. What's the whole idea? That as you do nowcasting, say every week, whom are you trying to affect? The monetary policy authorities? That every week they charge, say the nowcast is jumping up and down. And what do? They react to that? They cannot possibly, right? So what's the whole purpose of nowcasting every week or every day? Why are you doing that?
Yeah, so outside a crisis period, the monetary policy authorities meet in the U.S., for example, 8 times a year. They need forecast 8 times a year. So even in that outside of crisis context, being able to accommodate a weekly release schedule is helpful. Just because, I'm staff, I need the nowcast are important inputs into my forecast at the time that I need to produce my forecast. Being able to account for the most recent data and producing my nowcast is a useful input to that medium-term forecast outside of crisis periods. So the part of our interest in the weekly in this case was, in a crisis period when things are changing quickly, and a monetary authority or fiscal authority, as happened in this crisis, is making decisions, is trying to move quickly and make decisions quickly. Having a more timely read on just how quickly things are declining and the extent to which they're declining is a helpful input into those policy decisions. Normal course of affairs, hopefully that's not normal. But that's the thought. That's our two thought process on that.
Thank you. Very nice presentation.
Thank you.
Any other comments?
Maybe, if I may, if there are no other comments, I can. Yeah.
Can I ask a question? This is Giorgio Primiceri.
Okay.
Yeah. Please go ahead, Giorgio.
Yeah. So this is nothing to do with COVID, but I found the results quite interesting, and I wonder, Todd, if you can connect them a little bit more with this growing literature on quantile regressions, growth at risk, inflation at risk, that people are applying to many variables. I personally find that literature interesting, but sometimes I struggle to understand really, what's going on, what explains the findings, and maybe you can say a little more about those findings with your method. So anyway.
Yeah, and we have some other work that's on the tail risk. It's not focused on nowcasting. It's more medium, quarter ahead, year ahead. And as you know, people have been quick to jump on that bandwagon and run quantile regression lots of places. There is reason to temper some of that enthusiasm and take a closer look as to what's driving the patterns the patterns that people think are in the data, but also whether those those patterns are there. So for papers, Mikkel Plegborg-Moller, Lucretia Reichland, and two other co-authors who escape me, have a paper coming out in Brookings that looks at the tail risk literature, and they come away arguing that most of the information in financial indicators and other indicators is really about the mean, and there's not a whole lot of predictability and the other dimension of the predictive distribution. So that requires, not requires, I think it does warrant stepping back a bit in this literature and what exactly do we think we're getting at, and how do we get at it? And then there is structural work being done by Laura Velkamp and others on how to model the drivers of tail risk, et cetera, et cetera. But it's a good point. I agree.
Okay, great. In the interest of time, we're going to move forward. Thank you, Todd. Our next speaker is Eleonora Garanzero from Nordic Bank.
Hello.
Yeah, please go ahead, share your screen.
Perfect. Okay. Let me just put in. Great, perfect. Okay, so thank you so much, Simon and Laurent, for including this paper in the program. This is joint work with Knut Are, who is in the audience, and with a few other co-workers, colleagues at the Norges Bank. So what we do in this paper is that we document the usefulness of debit card transaction data to nowcast household consumption on average over a long evaluation sample, and then given the focus of the conference, we illustrate the usefulness also during the COVID pandemic. So I guess it's kind of obvious to the audience that policymakers policymaking is based on an assessment of current economic conditions, which should be as accurate as possible. But unfortunately, the macroeconomic aggregates over which these policy decisions are based are usually available with a lag. And therefore, policymakers have to rely on early assessments of macro aggregates, which rely on indicators. These indicators should have these three desirable properties. So they should be available without a lag. They should not be subject to revisions, and they should be highly correlated with the variable of interest. Now, I think that as Todd's presentation has stressed, the COVID pandemic has actually highlighted a need for indicators that are available at an even higher frequency in order to track the real economy in a timely manner. Now, while there are already some indicators available for the supply side, there are not many options to track the demand side. And again, some recent papers like the one by Guerrieri and co-author have shown that, given the current pandemic, it's important to look also at the demand side. Now, for all these reasons, we focus our analysis on debit card transaction data, which are available usually daily. They are usually not revised, and they cover a large proportion of household consumption expenditure. So in the case of Norway, for example, they cover about 35% of total household consumption. So what do we do specifically in the paper is if we evaluate the point and density forecast accuracy of debit card data for quarterly Norwegian household consumption over the sample 2011 Q4, 2020 Q1. So let me stress that again, we look at density forecast because in these times of heightened uncertainty, we think it's important to also characterize the uncertainty around our point forecast. So for predictors, we use both the value of payments as well as the number of transactions. And in order to match the mixed frequencies of our data, we consider MIDAS models, both at the monthly and weekly frequency. We compare the results with of the models included the bank accept data or debit card data with standard benchmarks, so an autoregressive model, and several alternative high frequency indicators. And we actually document a really remarkable superior performance of the models that include debit card data. So for point forecast accuracy, gains are higher than 50% with respect to the AR, which is actually a very competitive benchmark. The differences in performance are statistically significant, and we observe, as in Todd's case, a steady improvement over the quarter. Then, and I guess it's going to be of interest given the focus of the conference, we illustrate the really astonishing performance of the debit card data during the COVID pandemic. In particular, the models that include the volume of transactions are the one that provide a more accurate nowcast for the consumption. And we observe large improvements over the AR from the first week of in which the lockdown measures were implemented. So just a quick review of the literature. So of course, we are related to the literature on nowcasting, on density nowcasting. Then there are a few papers, recent papers on nowcasting with payments data for some central banks, from some central banks who got access to this data. I would say the marginal contribution with respect to those studies is that we look at density rather than point forecast. We specifically take into account the mixed frequency of the data, and we illustrate, of course, the importance of this data set during periods with large shocks. And then we add to the literature on nowcasting the Norwegian economy. And of course, we are related to some of the papers that are presented in this conference as well for nowcasting during the COVID pandemic. Okay, so let me start by talking a little bit about the transaction data. So we think that Norway is an ideal economy to study the usefulness of this data because Norway is a near cashless economy. In fact, cash withdrawals are only 8% of total card usage in 2019. And 8 out of 10 card transactions were made with debit cards, which constitutes 71% of the total value. And as I was mentioning before, debit card transactions cover 35% of the total value of household consumption. So Norges Bank actually was able to gain access to this data set in January 2020. So in this sense, it was very positive that we got access in such an important time. The debit card was available at the weekly frequency since January 2006 and at the daily frequency, but only from January 2019. And this means that basically for now we are bounded to use the weekly frequency as the more granular frequency. The data covers all debit card transactions via Bank Accept, which is the national payment system in Norway. So the idea is that if you have a bank account in Norway and you have a debit card, then the transactions is going to be registered through this Bank Accept data set, and we are going to see it. So of course, there are some other transactions, Visa or MasterCards, but so credit cards, but these are usually done for payments abroad or online. And we have access to both the value and the number of transactions available. So this is just to get you familiarized with the data, since you might not be very familiar with Norwegian data. This is the evolution or the time series of consumption and the Bank Accept data over the sample 2006-2020. Here is the quarter-over-quarter growth, and in the red line is consumption. So this variable has been quite stable since the 90s, with an average growth rate of 1.2% per quarter. So there have been some episodes of negative growth, of mild negative growth, such as the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, and then a larger drop again due to the Great Recession in 2010. But overall, again, you can see the dynamics are fairly stable. We have observed some other negative values in negative territories after the oil price shock in 2015. And finally, we had, these 2020 figures are quite large in terms of drop relative to historical numbers. Okay, so some more details about the forecast evaluation exercise. In terms of the benchmark model, as I was mentioning, we use an AR process. Given again the dynamics that I illustrated in the figure, we think that this is it's quite a appropriate way to model the dynamics of quarter-on-quarter growth of consumption. And so YT here is the quarter-over-quarter, our target variable. Again, to take into the account the fact that we have this high frequency indicator, we use MIDAS models, where this XNT is the high frequency indicator. We use, for each model, we consider only one high frequency indicator, either at the monthly or when they are available at the weekly frequency. So we're gonna have a large number of models given the set of predictors that we're gonna use. In terms of the errors, we are assumed that they're gonna be normally distributed. So computing or constructing the density forecast is gonna be quite straightforward. Okay, so here are is the list of the high frequency regressors that we are using. We use a few regressors that cover financial markets, uncertainty, labor market conditions, and of course sales. So the Bank Accept data are the data set that I referred to and that I already described. For stock prices, we use the Oslo Stock Exchange. Uncertainty and financial news are based on some indices based on some textual data for Norway constructed by a colleague from Norges Bank. The car sales is the volume of cars delivered in the month. And an important indicator, which is going to be quite competitive, is retail sales. So this is a survey-based index that is sent to all Norwegian companies. The response rate is 99%. so it gives quite a good coverage. And of course, it's going to be important when we consider this during the COVID pandemic. This measure, this index doesn't include services. So just the last few details on the forecasting exercise. So in Norway, the official quarterly statistics are released about 6 weeks after the end of the reference quarter. So when we look at the monthly analysis, we evaluate the monthly nowcast at 3 forecast origins. After the end of the first month, so there we have available the first monthly release of the monthly indicators, but we still do not have available the previous quarter GDP. Then we evaluate at the end of the second month, so we have 2 months of the quarter of interest available for the high frequency indicator, and we also finally get the previous quarter release for consumption. And finally, after the end of the third month, so we have full information for the full quarter information for the monthly indicators and the previous quarter value for consumption. For weekly data, instead, the evaluation is done 13 times and at the end of each week in the quarter. So usually it's on the Monday after the full week has progressed. So for the Midas model, we keep things quite simple. We use an Almond lag polynomial, which means that we can estimate the model with OLS. Everything is going to be linear and simple. And for the regressors, so we use, this is a bit, I guess, different from what Todd has done. We always use the past 3 months for monthly frequency and always the past 13 weeks for weekly frequency. So this means that basically we use some information from the previous quarter and some information from the current quarter. And at the end of the quarter, then we only have, we have the full information only for the quarter of interest. We select a rolling estimation scheme with R equal to 22. In terms of the estimation sample, sorry, we are bounded by the availability of the data. So we have to start our estimation in 2006 Q1. And for the evaluation, we start in 2011 Q4 because this is the first vintage for which we have reliable real-time data for consumption. So the real-time, so again, we use real-time data for consumption. All the other indicators except retail sales are not revised, so we don't have to worry about that. And we evaluate our nowcast against the first release. In terms of loss function, here we're not very exotic. We use root mean square forecast error for point forecast accuracy and logarithmic scores for density. Okay, so here I can already start showing you the results for the forecast evaluation exercise. Here are the relative root mean square forecast error for the monthly frequency. Now the 3 different columns refer to the 3 different forecast origin within the quarter. And the numbers in the table, of course, if we have a number less than 1, it means that the model outperforms the autoregressive. The one thing that I want you to highlight is that going from column 1, so 1 month, to 2 months, the denominator changes because the AR model, in the AR model, we can include the previous quarter GDP released starting from the 2 months forecast origin. So the table already shows that basically the AR model is actually a very difficult benchmark to beat. Only the unemployment rate and retail sales, and of course our bank accept data, are able to improve over the AR model. So for retail sales, the gains are quite large, and similar gains can be observed also for our bank accept data, and you can see quite a steady improvement over the quarter. Now, to be fair to our models, to our preferred models, I have to say that retail sales, we are giving an unfair advantage to the retail sales models because we are disregarding the fact that they are revised and that they are released with 1 month lag. So here we are assuming that they are released contemporaneously to the bank accept data, which is not the case. Moreover, we think that even if retail sales seems to be doing very well, the bank accept data are still a more desirable indicator because they're available at the weekly frequency. And also you will see that they had a superior performance during the COVID pandemic. Okay, so now we have also the evolution of the point forecast throughout the quarter for each week. Now the number of indicators available at the weekly frequency is very limited, so we are considering only stock prices and uncertainty. Again, the entries here are the relative root mean square error with respect to the AR model. And as you can see, and this is, of course, each forecast origin as we progress throughout the quarter. And as you can see here, we have, again, a steady improvement over the quarter, particularly after we have the first month or the first 4 weeks of data available, while the other indicators are really hopeless in this case. So the idea here is just to show that, it's not just because you have a high frequency indicator that you're going to be able to capture or to nowcast well, but you really need to be careful in the indicators that you are considering. Okay, so I guess in the interest of time, I might skip the results for the density, but the message is quite similar. So the bank accept data in value and volume are outperforming the AR, both for the monthly and the weekly frequency. Okay, so now the focus of the, I hope that I convinced you that these debit card data were useful on average to nowcast. So let's see how they did during the pandemic. So in Norway, we experienced the first case of infection at the end of February, and the lockdown restrictions were implemented on March 12, which correspond to week 11. So as a consequence, the registered unemployment went up to 10.7 in March from 2.7 in February. We're going to talk about the debit card transaction data, but the drops were really large, especially for the volume of transaction. And the stock prices plummeted by almost 25% month to month from February to March. The uncertainty index almost doubled. While the retail sales in March actually increased by 3.7%, which was driven by increase in purchases of food and also vehicles, because as I was mentioning before, retail sales, which includes car sales, basically the measures at the time when the cars are delivered, not when they're ordered. And as a result, the quarter-over-quarter growth rate of consumption actually fell by an astonishing 10.2%. So what I'm going to show you here is the weekly time series of debit card data for 2020 Q1 from week 2 to week 14 compared to the same weeks in 2019. And this is just the level of the data. The vertical line here, the red vertical line, shows the week in which the lockdown measures were implemented, which again is week 11. So I wanted to already show you that, so the right panel shows you the volume of transactions, so the number of transactions, and the left panel shows you the value of transaction. And as you can see, in terms of volume, we observe a decline already from week 10. And in percentage terms, the decline was much sharper. While for the value, actually, we had an increase in week 11 because people went, to the grocery stores to buy groceries to pile up for the lockdown, to prepare for the lockdown. But the idea is that there were transactions of larger value, but fewer transactions. And the value also has recovered much more quickly, while the volume has remained quite low. Now, in the next figures, we're kind of are going to break down the data a little bit more in detail. So on the upper panel, I'm showing you the value, but now we are distinguishing between goods and services. At the bottom, I show the number of transactions, and here again, we're distinguishing between goods and services. So what I wanted to show you is that in terms of value for services, the picture is quite similar. both if we look at value or volume. So we had a decline, a very sharp decline already 1 week before the lockdown measures. So people stopped going to restaurants and pubs and hairdressers. So this is really, a demand shock, if you will. And then it stayed quite stable over time. While for the goods, we observe actually some sort of a recovery and kind of a softer drop. So basically, these explain, so the fact that this drop is more marked for volume is gonna also explain the performance of the nowcast for the volume models. So let me see. Okay, so this is the evolution of the point forecast for the monthly frequency. I can go back to it if we have time later on, but I wanted to focus on the density forecast. So this is the nowcasting for the monthly frequency indicators for each month. And as you can see, what I wanted to show is basically that, as soon as we get to the third month of data, so when we got March, after the lockdown measure, we can observe, so these are the AR density forecast, is the blue, and then the two green are the density forecasts for the value and volume of transaction. And as you can see, we can observe a very swift shift to the left for both value and volume, and the volume of transaction actually gave us a point forecast of minus 9.7, which is extremely close to the minus 10.2 correct realization of consumption. And they're very concentrated around these negative values. And just the last slide, so this is compared to retail sales, which is the dashed line. You can see that the bank accept data do much better than retail sales in this instance. And then finally here we're looking at the weekly frequency. I just wanted to point out that we start with week 10, where the point forecasts were almost all the same. Week 11 we have a shift to the left, and more dispersed densities for the volume and volume. We have a further shift in week 12 where the situation got worse, and then week 13 we have a little bit of improvement, especially for the value of a transaction. So we observe a small shift to the right, and the density became a bit more concentrated. So just to conclude, I hope that, again, I showed you, I convinced you that these debit card data are accurate predictors of consumption, both on average and on the COVID pandemic. And the last message I want to leave you with is that, even though we have focused on the Norwegian example, we think that these indicators can be very useful in real-time monitoring of consumption, especially for countries where card payments account for a high share of consumption expenditure. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Eleonora. Just as a reminder, as a panelist, you can always turn on your video and audio at the end of the presentation to ask questions. For the general audience attendees, you can always make comments in the Q&A box at the end of the screen. So I will collect the questions at the end of each presentation. I see Laurent here has a comment. Laurent, please go ahead.
Yes, a short comment. Many thanks, Eleonora. That's a wonderful paper. You have a great database, and the results that you show are really impressive. So it seems to be super useful. No, I was thinking, I don't know exactly the design of the database, but I imagine that you have access to a large amount of data. And maybe in that case, some papers are saying that it can be good to pre-select. That is to target a little bit data among this large database. So we have quite evidence on this. So I was wondering, all the results that you showed are based on all the data, right? So maybe it could be good to pre-select a little bit by looking at the type of transaction that has been done, for example, the type of goods or the type of services. I think that could be super useful to have this kind of information to look at if you can improve the accuracy based on pre-selection, in fact.
Yeah, so what we have done, it's not exactly what you're asking, but I guess it goes into this direction. we have looked at forecast or nowcasting components of consumption, and we split the bank accept data into goods and services. And so here is just an example, so for example, here, if you want to nowcast consumption of goods with debit card for goods, we actually obtain a nowcast on improvements even of almost 75%. So yeah, so we can definitely cut the data in different ways too. But we got access to the data set in January. So we are still kind of getting familiar with it, and we are very excited to work on it and look at many more dimensions for sure.
Okay, I'm going to ask a question from the general audience. Andrew asked, I was wondering if the authors had a look at the time varying accuracy of their models.
Time varying accuracy, I think, is challenging because the data set that we have available, it's not that, doesn't go far back. But again, I think, consumption has been quite stable in Norway. So for this reason, we are not too worried about structural breaks or other issues that, might require a time varying analysis. But I think now, we have 34 observations in our evaluation samples. So I think that breaking them down further in subsamples could be, I'm not sure how informative it would be.
Okay, I see that Kadro turned on the video. Please go ahead, Kadro.
Eleonora, great paper. I'm curious about one thing. You must have seen this, that this is the first recession in the US history where the consumption and income has moved differently. That consumption has fallen really, really a lot compared to income, okay? So yes, your model, I'd expect, yeah, because of the debit card and retail sales and so on, would pick up. But this model as a nowcast for GDP or income may not be that good, right? Have you observed this?
So we tried. So I couldn't, again, we've been trying this in the past few weeks. So I tried on average, and it was not that bad. But it's true that for the nowcast of 2020 Q1, it was not excellent. I think one reason is because, in Norway, there is so much fiscal space that, GDP might not have fallen as much, so Norway may be a little bit more different from the US. So I think the fiscal stimulus implemented in Norway has, as a consequence, has decreased GDP much less than consumption.
Right. Same in USA. Same in USA. Yeah. Thank you. Very interesting paper. Thank you.
Thank you.
Matteo, you have comments? Yeah, please go ahead.
Just one question for Eleonora. How did you deal with the fact that probably the bank data have this their own trend related to the fact that the use of bank data increased over time, over your sample? So that could represent a problem when you're trying to...
That's why, yes. So we have seen that there has been a steady increase in the amount of or the ratio between the debit card data and consumption value. So, but it hasn't been dramatic. So that's again, the sample is quite short. It's from 2006. So we went from about 28 to 35%, which we don't think is huge. So Norway was already quite a a cashless economy back in the early 2000s. But the way we dealt with it was to use rolling window estimation. So that's why although we did the robustness check with expanding window, our preferred option is to use rolling window. So we use like a quite short window of 22 quarters to estimate our models.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I have a quick question, Eleonora. Can you say something about the distribution of credit card, debit card transactions across different sectors? Because for US, we know that consumption for some sector, like online gaming, online education is increased, right? But of course, for majority of sectors like grocery shopping, decline. Will you see some pattern there in Norway?
So I'm not sure if Knut-Are knows a little bit more about this, but I haven't specifically looked into it. So I don't know how to answer to your questions. I don't know if Knut-Are has more.
Okay, look forward to seeing.
But again, we just started looking at this, so we definitely can, and we are interested. I mean, we have transaction level data, right? So we can even track your consumption, Simon. In principle, so we can see how you reacted to the pandemic. So we can do a lot of with this data, but yeah, we haven't got to it yet.
Okay, great. I look forward to seeing the next version of the paper. Thanks, Eleonora. Okay, our next speaker is Eleonora. Please stop sharing your screen.
Sure, yeah.
Okay, our next speaker is Matteo Magliani from Bank of France.
Okay.
Great, please go ahead.
Good? Okay, thank you. So thank you very much. This is a joint work with Laurent Ferrara and Jean-Guillaume Sayuk. Before I start, of course, the views expressed in this paper are those of the authors and do not reflect those of the Banque de France. So this is quite good. This paper comes at this point of the workshop because maybe you can find here some answers to the questions raised during the first presentation in part of the second presentation. So what is our motivation behind this paper? So there is a large theoretical and empirical literature about the linkages between financial markets and real activity, in particular about the transmission and propagation of shocks on the financial markets. So we are now quite convinced that the relationship between financial indicators, financial variables, and economic growth, real activity, is quite complex and nonlinear. Very recently, Adrian and co-authors developed this tool that we talked about earlier in the workshop, which is the growth at risk, the GAR. They developed this tool for measuring the financial risk to United States economic growth. So what is this GAR approach? It's simply a quantitative regression of GDP on some past financial conditions, which are in their paper proxied by the National Financial Condition Index of the Chicago Fed, and past activity, which is in this paper proxied by a lag or lags of GDP. And this tool is quite nice because it's used to monitor the skewing of the entire growth distribution according to the evolution on shocks over financial markets. So here in this slide, I just represented what somewhere recomputed the elasticity of GDP growth to financial condition index that could be obtained using the similar data set as the one used by Adrian and co-authors, and also the same exercise using the data used recently by Figueres and Jarosinski. And you can see this the motivation behind this GAR approach as the estimated coefficient in this quantitative regression are asymmetric compared to a standard simple OLS. We showed with the co-authors of this paper recently in a Banque de France blog that this tool, this growth at risk, can be also used for monitoring the financial risk to GDP growth of the euro area. So the GAR approach is very, very interesting, and now it's quite used in the literature. There are very recent examples published very, very recently. One problem we found with this literature is that this GAR is usually calculated at quarterly frequency, which is the frequency of GDP. However, we are quite convinced that policy decisions usually require a very prior assessment of all the economic scenarios, including the most extremes, but very, very quickly as possible. So that in this paper, we extend the growth at risk model of Adrian by taking into account the the fact that the financial condition index are usually produced at high frequency, and in this case, we are going to use a specific financial condition index for the euro area, which is produced at a daily basis. So we build an empirical model which replicates in some way the growth at risk structure, but it's based on the Midas quantile regression. And then we can obtain a very straight mapping between GDP and a very recent and even current sequence of financial conditions that provides a daily monitoring of financial risk to real activity. And also we can use this tool, even if it's not built exactly for doing this job, but we can use it to provide a nowcast measure of GDP tail risk, as we could see in the presentation by Todd Clark. So let me describe a little bit the dataset we use in this paper. So the paper is based on a complete real-time approach. So we use for this purpose a complete collection of euro area GDP vintages that we include in a data trapezoid spanning from the third quarter of 2000 to the fourth quarter of 2019. So the main diagonal of this data set starts in first quarter 2010, and we have to bear in mind that from Eurostat, which is the National Statistical Institute for the euro area, or for the European Union actually, we got multiple releases per quarter, and the number of releases changed over time from 2 to 4 in recent years. So the release date is a very, very crucial information for this real-time exercise, because the model includes here, as in Adrian and all the growth at risk literature, a lag of GDP, which is not actually available at time t before the release of GDP at time t -1. So the release date varies here over time according to the process, the methods used by Eurostat. So it spans between plus 45 days before 2016 and plus 30 days thereafter, including the recent years. So before the release, in our model, we use a proxy of GDP at time t-1, which is provided by Eurocoin, which is a good proxy for the growth rate of GDP in the euro area. As for the financial condition index, we use a particular index built at the Banque de France, which is based on a recent economic bulletin of the Banque de France published by Petronovich and Sayuk. So this financial condition index is based on 18 daily financial series, which are selected as they are regularly monitored by the central banks, that are combined in 6 main factors. These factors are the main components of the aggregated financial condition index. To aggregate these subcomponents into the main index, Petronovich and Sayuk used a set of weights that are constructed using the volatility of this index. So in this way, the financial condition index we use in this paper is used as well 2 kinds of information: the actual level of the indicators and as well their volatility. So in this picture, you have the main features over time. This is, remember, a daily indicator of the euro area financial condition index that we use. And you can see, of course, you can spot the evolution of this index during the Great Recession 2008-2009, and also during the euro area financial crisis between 2011 and 2013. So this data set does not include the latest developments related to the COVID situation, but we have a nice application of this. So how do we estimate this model, knowing that we have this daily financial condition index? We relate on a quantile Midas model. So I won't spend time on these models because they were already described quite well by Todd Clark and Eleonora Garanziera in the previous presentation. So just keep in mind that we regress in a quantile regression, GDP over a lag of GDP and our financial condition index. So this financial condition index, since it's sampled at the daily frequency, we match the sampling frequency of the GDP using the usual weighting function in this Midas literature. So here we use a normal lag polynomial, which has the main advantage of keeping everything linear. So we can use standard quantile regression approaches to estimate this model. And another important advantage of this using this specific polynomial function is that the model is parsimonious, since you use only a bunch of parameters here described by the number of parameters p plus 1, which p is the order of the polynomial, and also can incorporate linear zero restrictions, which is very important to us because we can, in this way, stabilize a little bit this polynomial function, and also include some restrictions that are economically meaningful for us. So the method used here to estimate this model is a Bayesian quantile Midas regression with, of course, some lag polynomials. So again, I won't spend time on this because Todd Clark already made a great review of this kind of estimators. So I just keep the presentation to the algorithm we use to estimate our growth at risk. So first of all, we estimate the model that I showed you before here, using a Bayesian quantile regression approach. And this for each age lag, with age going from 0 up to some value, which is in practice here, from the last to the first business day of each quarter. Then we compute the quantile function for a given number of quantiles that we want, at each time t, conditional of some sample information available at the time t minus h. So we get this value, q hat. Then, following the recent literature, the approach used in Adrian encoders, we fit this qt distribution to the collection of quantiles estimated empirically using this Bayesian Midas approach, and we get some smooth, or the wall, if you want, the wall density of the conditional distribution of GDP. From this, we gather, in particular, the 10th quantile of the distribution for all lags, for all age, and we obtain, finally, our real-time high frequency growth at risk at the 10th quartile. So in order to illustrate our model, I have a set of applications to present. The first one is related to the euro area recession observed between the end of 2011 and the beginning of 2013. So as you can see in the shaded area here, I highlight the recession period. We have a shock on financial conditions starting in 2011. And then this shock maps quite well into the GAR 10%. So we know that we can see that the GAR is increasingly signaling and pointing to a deterioration or increase in the risk for real activity. And that is even before the recession actually starts. So we have a nice application here to show that this kind of tool can provide a picture, an advanced picture of the risk of future recession for the euro area. The second application, given the topic of the workshop, will be about nowcasting. Here I focus only on the period 2010-2019. And as you can see, the gray area is the full distribution of our conditional distribution of GDP provided by our model. And as you can see, this estimated conditional distribution follows quite well the pattern of GDP over time. So in this sense, this tool can provide an advanced detection of GDP downturns, as shown here, and in general, a good picture of the pattern of GDP over time. To be more formal, here we computed some metrics, some measure of the quality of the nowcasting of our model compared to other simple models. The first one is the Bayesian Midas. So it's simply the same model and not estimated with quantile regression. And the second one is an autoregressive quantile regression. So in this one, we omit the financial condition index in the regression, actually. As metrics, we use the continuous ranking probability score, the quantile weighted probability score, which is exactly the same idea, but here we focus mainly on the left tail of the distribution, which is most important for us. So downside risk actually to growth. And here we have the quantile score, the same measure as Tolkien used in the first presentation. As you can see, the bold blue values denote the best outcomes. These are all these outcomes are compared to a simple AR benchmark. And we can see that our Bayesian Midas quantile regression actually provides over the whole sequence of nowcast. So 0 year means actually the last day of the quarter, and 60 denotes the first day of a quarter. Our model provides the best outcomes overall. In particular, when we focus on the quantile score over the 10th quantile, we see that our model can beat quite easily the competing models. So now we can switch to the third application of our model, which is the behavior of our euro area daily growth at risk and during the COVID episode. So as I said, with this tool, we can compute the whole conditional distribution of GDP over time, every day. So we start here, for instance, at the end of January, and the distribution is quite symmetric, and the mode of distribution is around plus 0.5% growth. When we move towards the start of the COVID crisis, you can see that this distribution jumped to a mode which is lower, but the distribution is still quite symmetric, even if the left tail starts to become more skewed toward the left. And then once we are in the midst of the crisis, it means during the May of April and May and June, the distribution is changed completely in the sense that the left tails go very deep toward the very negative values. That means that our daily GAR are pointing to a huge increase of downside risk to growth. Then we can also map the behavior of our measure of downside risk over time, every day. So the blue line represents our growth at risk measure at 10%. The red line is the financial condition index, and the dots provide the value of the euro coin, which is in general a quite good estimate of GDP growth over the quarter. As you can see, the blue line is quite stable up to mid-March, which is more or less for the euro area the start of the COVID crisis and the lockdown that started in Italy, then Spain, and then France and Germany, and so on. So then the GAR 10% start pointing to a very important increase in downside risk to growth, because it moves from about 0 up to -1%. And then this is fairly stable over time. Then here, at this point, around the 30 April, the actual value of GDP for Q1 is released, and then there is a huge drop of the GAR towards a value around -4%. So the actual value of GDP for Q1 is around -3.8%. And you can see that the GAR, of course, cannot detect accurately this value, but there is no model, as far as we know, which is able to capture this large drop in GDP for Q1, at least for the euro area, and in real time. So wrapping up, we provided with this tool a way of monitoring real time the downside risk of the downside financial risk to GDP growth for the euro area. In doing so, we extended the literature of the growth at risk by taking advantage of the high frequency nature of the financial condition index that we have. We provide some application. Actually, we have more applications in the paper that I have no time to illustrate today. The way this policy tool can be used in terms of monitoring the macroeconomic environments. And finally, we showed that during this COVID crisis, COVID episode, the euro area daily growth at risk could not, of course, accurately measure the drop of real activity, but can provide a really good timely indication of the tail risk on GDP. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Matteo. Let me ask the first question here. Have you considered the number of confirmed COVID-19 cases and number of deaths in your estimation?
No, the model here for the COVID episode, we just wanted to stick with the most simple and general model. So we did not extend the model using additional variables, indicators, or other real-time non-economic indicators. So here the model is as simple as can be. And what is important is that the COVID crisis, the COVID episode, is not a financial shock, basically. But even if it's not a financial shock, with this tool, we can capture a very important downside risk to real activity. So it shows that using this tool, even when we do not deal with financial issues, it could be a good idea in terms of monitoring real activity.
Okay, great. We have Anna here, Anna Gallo.
Hi.
Do you want to make some comment? Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question. So in your picture, we could clearly see that the left tail got extended, right? But you didn't get the shift of the density to the left. That's the hardest bit to get. And you said it's very hard to capture that with data. Do you think then this means that there is a scope of judgment or add external information in the forecasting models because the model is not able to capture the size of the change very fast? Do you have any views on that? On how you could get a shift to the left?
I believe that if we could, well, we wanted to keep the model, as I said before, keep the model simple. So using just the financial indicator. And the COVID crisis is not a financial crisis, basically. But then if we imagine you can add, of course, in this model, more daily indicators. I mean, electricity consumption, for instance. And then you should observe, this is my guess, you should observe a shift in the mode distribution towards the left, because then if there is at least a good econometric relationship between GDP and whatever activity indicator, the full distribution should be affected by including additional variables. That was shown, in my opinion, by the first paper in this workshop. So they include many indicators in their model. And if I'm not wrong, the left tail goes very down, but also the mode of the distribution. So extending this model to other indicators could be surely beneficial.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. I saw that you cited a paper by Esther Rees. I think Esther is very much interested in your work and would like to make a brief comment. And if possible, she would like to draw some connection to her own work. Esther, are you ready?
Yes, I am. Thank you very much. By the way, before I start, I have a question about the slide that you have now, Matteo, and it's related with Anna's question also, and is whether you have checked when you are doing the quantile regression just to get the densities that you have in here, whether you have checked whether the financial index is significant in these regressions. Because maybe it's not, I mean, this is just the auto-regressive part of the quantile regression. So the financial index here is nothing to do at all. Have you checked whether they are significant or not?
Yeah, of course. Well, the coefficient is not very close to 0. Here, if you look at this picture, you can see that when the lag, the actual GDP in quarter one is released, you have a huge drop. But here you have to bear in mind that this drop is something that we have never seen in the area. So of course, whatever coefficient you put in your in the autoregressive part of the model, you get a large drop of the GAR 10% indicator. Then the problem is, well, let's say the problem that we are using, let's say a short sample, which is almost from since the beginning of the area. And then if you look at the significance of the coefficients that are obtained from the posterior draws of our Bayesian model, of course, the distribution is quite large, but we are not over 0 looking at one standard deviation. So I have no slides showing these standard errors for the financial condition index, but it's, let's say, quite significant with some flexibility.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, Matteo, please stop sharing your screen.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. Right. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay. So first of all, I want to thank Simon and Laurent just for putting me in the very last moment within the workshop. This has been great. And well, what I am going to say is joint work with Gloria Gonzalez Rivera and Javier Maldonado. And somehow it's related with both Mateo's and Todd talks, and it's growth in stress. So I want to emphasize that this is not risk, is stress. That's the difference in the word, although it sounds very similar. So let me just explain what we mean. So when we have growth at risk in the paper that Mateo just described by Adrian Boynarchenko and Giannone, they are assessing the effect of financial conditions on the expected distribution of GDP growth. Okay, so that's what we have seen before, how financial conditions affect different quantiles of the GDP growth. And well, this is the quantile regression that we have seen before. See that here we have past growth on one hand, and then factors. And these factors in the previous two papers, both by Todd and by Matteo, these factors are financial factors. And I want just to point out that they are local factors. Somehow the financial factors are obtained using principal components or whatever method in the States in one hand, okay, in the first paper by Todd, or in the Euro area in the second paper by Matteo. But they are local factors. Okay, in the paper by Matteo, Logan et al., they just extend this idea having mixed data. Okay, so let me explain what we mean by growth in stress. Remember that what we have is the growth, the density of growth, different quantiles of growth depending on factors. And in these models, the factors are average factors. I mean, somehow we extract the factors and we are introducing into the model to explain the quantiles of growth, mean factors. In our proposal, what we want to measure is how growth answers or response is affected by stress in the factors. What's happened when the factors go to the extremes? I mean, they are random variables at the end, even if they are unobserved, and of course they have a distribution. So let me just explain in this picture what we mean. Here we assume that we have two different factors, F1 and F2, and these ellipses that we have in here are ellipses. This one is of coverage alpha 1%, and the second one is alpha 2. Think, for example, that we have the 95% ellipse. So the factors are contained in this region with a given probability. And here what we have is the growth for different quantiles. So we are also going to work with quantiles regression of growth over the factors. And here we are measuring what is the growth in a given quantile with a combination of the factors. And what we are going to measure the growth in stress, this definition is what is the minimum growth that we can expect when the factors are stressed, in the sense that they are in, for example, the 95% contours. Okay, let me show you the definition. Here you have the quantile regression. This is exactly the same one that we have seen before, so nothing new here. This is the quantile tau for growth, depends on past growth and depends on past factors. And we define growth in stress as the minimum quantile of growth when the factors are subject to be in a given area, in the sense that we have, for example, if alpha is 5%, what we want the factor is to be in the extreme 95% probability. It's important to note that we are not forecasting, we are measuring what is the risk. We are measuring what is the minimum growth we can expect when the factors are stressed, when they just move to extreme values. Okay, so in the example that we have in the paper that was done with all data, this is annual data up to 2015, we are considering 87 countries and extracting the factors as world growth factors. Okay, so they are not local factors. We are looking at factors, and I think this is important now because what we are looking at in front of the COVID pandemic is something that is happening in all the world. So I don't think we need to look only to local factors. We should look at global factors, what is happening in the world. Well, in this paper, even without having this in mind, we were just extracting global factors. In this particular example, we have 3 different factors. And these are the ellipsoids that we obtained in 2 different years, in 1998 and 2004. So in 1998, you can see that the factors have less uncertainty, in a sense, while in 2004 is the ellipsoid that we have, the bigger one, we have much more uncertainty. Okay, and with respect with the drop, this is the densities that we estimate using these global factors. This is for the States and this is for China. And you can see this is the crisis in 2008. And we can see this drop of the growth to the left. So in that one sense, using these global factors, I think it's easier to catch up the drops in the densities. Okay, this is the comparison of the densities that we are estimating using the global factors when compared with the paper by Adrian et al. Here, even if we can see that there is this left tail of the densities going to the left, we don't see the drop in the average growth, and we observe it using the global factors. And finally, let me show you what is using new data, what we are measuring as a stress growth. These are the numbers given by the IFM. Okay, so for 2020, the global economy is expected to grow by 5%, advanced economies 8%, and emerging market minus 3%. And these are the numbers that we are obtaining. Okay, so we are computing the G's. Remember that this is what's happened when the factors are stressed. So they are not in average. They are just stressed to the 5% probability. And in average, we expect a draw in the minimum growth that we can expect in global is -10. In advanced countries, it's also -10. Emerging, developing, we are obtaining -10 in all cases. And advanced, the number given by the IMF is -8. So somehow here, we are measuring what is the danger, how far we can expect growth to go when the factors are stressed. Okay, so that's it. I think there are two different questions that we would like to research further. One is which factors we should use, whether we should use global factors or local factors. That's one thing that I think is interesting to look at. And second is the methodology that we are proposing here is an assessment of risk. I insist we are not forecasting as such. We are just measuring the risk of growth going down because the factors are stressed, whatever factors we have. So we can apply this to either financial factors or global factors. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Esther. Matthew and Laurent, do you want to give a very quick response? Matthew, can you hear me?
Sorry,
yeah.
I was
yeah.
Yeah. Very nice discussion and presentation. Thank you very much. As for our model, well, I don't know how I could introduce global factors on a high frequency basis. So the whole thing was about exploiting the dimension and the high frequency dimension of the financial condition index. So when I replied before about adding additional variables or adding additional indicators in the model, I was thinking about, for instance, electricity consumption, which is super domestic, is not at all a global factor, because it could be obtained on a daily or maybe weekly basis. There are not so many real activity indicators on a very high frequency basis, and that excludes, as far as I know, global indicators. So I would really like to include this kind of additional dimension in the model, looking outside, looking the world, as the world during this crisis was affected as much as the euro area, or even more. but I don't know how to do it in this kind of model. Otherwise, it's a very interesting extension, of course.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Let's take a short coffee break. 10 minutes. We'll be back.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Esther.
Thank you.
Difficult to reconcile the two models, in fact. Yeah,
But
we are dealing with very high frequency data.
I know.
You are dealing with more macro international data. So maybe it would be a junction in the sense if we could imagine having a kind of financial condition index, global financial condition index, you know, with this kind of model with the dynamic factor, hierarchical factor model with a global factor and idiosyncratic factor for countries, for example. And in that case, it could give an extension of this, maybe.
Yeah, it could be. I think, Laurent, that's how, I mean, the objectives are different. Obviously, you want to forecast in the very short run. It's obvious that your model is much better. I mean, that's why I was insisting. We are not forecasting. We are just measuring the risk. But I think sometimes it's confusing because people just talk about risk and they are measuring something else. They are forecasting. You know what I mean? It's like, I mean, the risk is, I mean, even you just have data, all data, and we were using annual data, so this is something that we need to improve. You can see that if the factors, in our case global, just go down very quickly because of something, for example, what is happening now, we are saying this is the risk, this is what you can expect. You can go down by 10%. So it's a different thing than trying to forecast.
Yeah, sure. It's a risk measure. It is equivalent in a sense of what is done in financial econometrics literature, that is measuring risk, looking more at higher moments of the distribution than focusing directly on the conditional expectation.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, I see very well. Yeah, good.
Okay, thank you.
You should update on a regular basis your model and publish it on the website.
We are trying now to do something. But, you know, you publish the paper, you forget about it, and now with all this COVID, and we felt that we need to do something. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Sure. Okay. Excellent. Thanks.
If you just come, this is a workshop on economic forecasting in time of COVID-19. This event is being recorded. Our next speaker is Brad Meyer from Atlanta Fed. Brad?
Yeah, I'm here, Simon.
Yeah. Can you please share your screen?
Sure. So thank you, everyone, for inviting me to present at this conference. I really appreciate this opportunity. Simon, you can hear me all right, right?
Yeah, I can, yeah.
Okay, excellent. Perfect time for things to freeze up on me. Excellent. So hello, everyone. This is going to be a bit of, I think, a departure relative to the first set of presentations that we saw today that were more on nowcasting using very rigorous modeling techniques, which I found absolutely fantastic. This is going to be more of a, if I get this to update, there we are. This is going to be a bit more in line with the workshop notion of this. This is a work in progress using survey data to track and understand how inflation expectations and uncertainty in particular are responding to the COVID pandemic and the shock that we're facing. So I want to start today with just a few facts and some background on the business inflation expectations data that we get from the Atlanta Fed. in part because we have folks from all over the globe, and you may or may not be familiar with this survey. Then I want to step into the behavior and examine inflation expectations before and during the coronavirus pandemic. And then through the use of quarterly and special questions, I want to investigate how these expectations have changed and really look at whether or not firms are viewing this more along the lines of a supply shock or a demand shock, and how their inflation expectations have changed. So some of the main takeaways are really firm and professional forecasters, their inflation expectations are reacting differently to the COVID-19 impact than consumers. I think consumers, and I'm going to provide some suggestive evidence, they're viewing this much more as a supply shock than firms and professional forecasters. And on net, I think firms are seeing the COVID-19 shock as largely demand shock. There are supply shock aspects, I'll mention those. And then despite the severity of the shock to near-term inflation expectations, firms longer on inflation expectations remain relatively unchanged. That might be a suggestion of anchoring. Oh, and I should back up and say that these are my views and mine alone. They don't necessarily represent the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta or the Federal Reserve System at large. So just some quick background. The Business Inflation Expectations, or BIE survey, is a monthly survey. It's conducted online through the use of Qualtrics of roughly 500 corporate C-suite execs and business owners in the 6th district. We've been conducting the survey since 2011. It's been in the field monthly since then. Our survey is not very taxing, so it takes about 4 minutes on average for these folks to complete this. We view that as instrumental to increasing and keeping a relatively high response rate and keeping keeping these C-suite execs attached to the survey. So their attachment over time has been better than some other monthly business surveys. And then last, we asked a few qualitative questions. Our survey is constructed with a few qualitative questions at the beginning, just to sort of set the mindset of the respondent about current business conditions around sales and around margins. Then the meat of our questionnaire is around the probabilistic question around firms' unit cost or firms' inflation expectations. We usually follow this up with some quarterly questions and special questions that we use in policy for giving policy advice and in research. So this is a screenshot of what it looks like in Qualtrics for one of our respondents to actually, when they're filling out the survey. And this is the heart of our survey. This is the probabilistic unit cost or inflation expectation over the next 12 months. And you can see we use a 5-bin approach. These have been static since the BIE's inception in 2011, and firms assign probabilities to each one of these bins. And then looking back over the last, we also ask a question that looks at their perceived current unit cost environment. So the perceived inflation environment that they're in, asking, looking back, however your unit cost compared with last time this year, and just asking them to, click which bucket or which bin that would be in. So I think probably here is probably a good point to talk about why we ask unit cost instead of an aggregate inflation measure. We've done a lot of work on this previously around question wording and design, and it's not entirely clear to us, especially given some of the literature out there by Fabienne, Yuri Grodnichenko, Hansit Afrazari, some of these other individuals, looking at an aggregate or a prices in general expectation. So when we were asking about, when we developed this survey, 2 things were really important. One is that the concept is applicable at all times. So even when aggregate inflation is low, we're still getting a signal on where costs or where expected costs are going in the economy, which may not be the case if inflation is very low and anchored. firms may have, these, they may be rationally inattentive. So any sort of ongoing survey isn't going to buy you a whole lot as far as predictive content. And the other thing that's really important is that the notion of forward-looking nominal marginal costs, or unit cost in this sense, really ties into the micro foundations of sort of generalized Phillips curve approach. And to be real honest, we asked these folks, what they pay more attention to, aggregate inflation or unit costs, and by and large, firms pay attention to unit costs and not so much to sort of aggregate inflation, or at least they haven't since 2011. So on this slide, this is comparing their unit cost or inflation perceptions to an aggregate inflation measure. And here we're using GDP deflator of the year-over-year growth rate. Again, it's comparable to the year-over-year unit cost approach. And since we're serving firms across, all industries and all firm sizes, the most direct comparison here would be the broadest measure of inflation, and that would be the GDP deflator. And you can see that these perceptions of unit costs track that aggregate inflation pretty closely. And I think what's even more interesting than this is that firms' unit cost expectations move in lockstep with professionals. So on the left side of this slide, you can see the correlation between the BIE inflation expectations and the survey professional forecasters out of the Philly Fed, their GDP deflator expectations. They're very highly correlated. And that is really something at the heart of why we're asking about this concept of forward-looking unit costs. They also tend to be fairly highly correlated with certain measures of consumer or retail expectations. And in fact, we could cut or reweight these data to give us something that looks more, by just looking at final goods producers and service firms. We could cut this and have this look closer to the CPI expectations as well. Continuing on about some of the background, again, about 70% or so of our panelists are CFO, CEO, and owner types. We have a preference towards getting at the CFO level or business owner if it's a smaller firm. And really, when we were doing cognitive testing, coming up with the survey, we wanted to make sure we were eliciting expectations from individuals that are able to see the future in sort of a probabilistic way, or at least have some scenarios around a good state, bad state, sort of what most likely state of the economy going forward. We found that C-suite folks and really the CFO types and then the business owners tend to do a better job at that than others. On the right-hand side, this is just to show that we have a lot of attachment to the survey. Our median respondent has responded at least 10 times. And we have some folks that have been with us since the beginning and have responded in just about every month. I think that's a little bit of a departure from a typical unbalanced panel design. As far as representatives, I want to skip over this quickly and get to some more interesting results. But as far as representativeness is concerned, it's very true that any business survey, any monthly business survey that you'll have in the US is going to be underweight small firms relative to the share of establishments. Unless you're able to get at the census's business register, the sampling frame for the business surveys or what's available to the public and to us is unable to get at the brand new small firms, that would typically, you would think of the garage or the basement startup types. As far as by industry is concerned, we overweight a bit cyclically sensitive industries on purpose. So manufacturing, construction, retail, transportation, wholesale, things like that. And then this is just a quick slide to show you there are active responses. So the number of active responses on the top panel, the share of active responses on the bottom, and then that dashed line is the response rate we got in 2019. So in fact, we made a concerted effort and a push to reach out to firms that are panelists and engage them in April. And I think that was the reason why we actually saw a spike in response rate. And I'm going to talk about this in a little bit. You might be questioning, well, some of these firms may have died during, or at least temporarily shut down during the COVID period. And that's true. Even some of the firms that were temporarily shut down, so they'd have sales relative to normal of 0 or 100% lower than normal. Those folks were in our panel. A handful of them continued to respond even though they were temporarily shut down. And then this is just on tenure effects. One thing that might cause some people some questions is whether or not, as firms with such a high attachment, whether or not their number of prior responses changes the way that they fill out the probability distribution or not. And we tend not to find significant evidence of that. One thing that we do find, and this is heartening, if you are going to put any weight on these data, is either by using just a very non-parametric approach, the sort of dot product of what's inside the probability distribution, or if we use a parametric approach. And here we're using the parametric approach that bimodal asymmetric power normal distribution. And we have another paper that digs into the details of that. But that basically it's a way to run a parametric approach that is that's robust to the ability for respondent to give you bimodality. And then here, either in the non-parametric or parametric approach, firms' expectations are related to their outcomes. So if they're telling you, costs are going to go up 2.5%, it's typically the case that they're coming in right around 2.5%. And then the same with unit cost uncertainty or inflation uncertainty. The absolute forecast errors tend to be related to the amount of uncertainty individuals have in real time. Okay, so on this slide, this is looking at the evolution of inflation expectations. In the upper left-hand corner, this is a business inflation expectations 1 year ahead. This is monthly. You can see in April, inflation expectations of the 1 year ahead dropped down to 1.4%. That's the sharpest and largest decline to its lowest level that we have on record going back to 2011. And this matched up, as I showed previously, with what survey of professional forecasters were showing us. However, if we dig into consumer inflation channel, this is the probabilistic 1 year ahead expectations from the New York Fed and the 1 year ahead inflation expectations from the University of Michigan. And you can see both of those during the COVID period, this period shaded in yellow, spiked up quite a bit. On the bottom right-hand side is just showing you correlations over time. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the firm business inflation expectations as measured by the BIE are highly correlated with those of professionals. And neither one of those are correlated with, highly correlated with what consumers are telling us about inflation expectations. And here, just as an aside, we have another survey that asks this probabilistic approach in a much more open format. So it not only is asking individuals to fill out probabilities across 5 buckets, it's actually asking for the estimates first and then assigning probabilities. We tested the unit cost expectations over a long period of time in that panel and found actually that their responses to that survey in aggregate were highly correlated with what we were getting out of the business inflation expectations panel. So it gives me some confidence that even our BIND approach is not biasing these inflation expectations in a significant way, at least directionally. So here's, on the first moment, again, firms and professionals are seeing this as lowering inflation expectations over the year ahead. Households are seeing this as something that's increasing their inflation expectations. We can look at uncertainty, and on the upper left-hand corner, this is the businesses' inflation uncertainty. This is the mean of the distributions. the mean variance. And you can see it's come up a little bit, but it's nowhere near as high as it was in 2019, when in the US we were dealing a lot with trade and tariff concerns. Same goes for the Philly Fed's SPF. However, in the New York Fed, they're able to capture what households are saying about the uncertainty, and they're saying this is a very, very uncertain inflation environment. Now, here there's another aspect that I don't want to talk too much about and run out of time, but you can see over time all of these measures, and we could expand this out to measures, market-based measures of inflation uncertainty. All of these things seem to have come down in concert from 2012 or so until maybe 2018. That's an interesting phenomenon that we'd want to investigate further. I don't have the time here, but it's something that we see across all sort of measures of inflation uncertainty. So digging into the household expectations, why are they seeing this thing as a big increase? And there's some really interesting survey data, a high frequency survey data out of the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland, and that actually asks firms how much of an impact do they see, a percentage point or percentage impact to inflation over the year ahead due to COVID. And here on average, or due to the pandemic we find ourselves in, and here on average, the respondents are telling us that they expect inflation to be about 8 percentage points higher than it currently was because of what it was pre-COVID, because of the pandemic. And here I think there's a sort of a sharp distinction between the way that firms and consumers are seeing this. And I think a lot of what's happening on the consumer side is tied to salient prices that are changing in the consumer market basket. So here is just looking at the CPI price change distribution since the beginning of March. Almost everything in that upper tail, that top 5% of the price change distribution, that's grocery store prices, right? And then someone might say, yeah, but fuel oil and gasoline prices have fallen in there in the lower tail. That's true. Maybe households aren't driving as much. Another interpretation of what's happening, why consumers are expecting, much higher inflation because of the COVID crisis, I think maybe gets at something inherent in the consumer surveys, in the way that they're asking these questions. It might actually be eliciting some sort of fragility or uncertainty about their nominal income prospects going forward, rather than something that would truly be an inflation expectation. So what's happening with firms? Let's dig into the distribution of the firms' probabilities. These are just some very simple histograms. They're plotting the means across each one of those bins. An average for January and March, and then an average from April till June. And these are flipped, and sorry about that, but unit cost up significantly is on the wrong side of these. But this actually is a meaningful shift in how respondents are assigning probabilities to these bins. I think maybe a better way to see this is looking at and plotting the distribution of their expected values. And you can see a marked shift from the pre-COVID period, January through March. And our March survey was the first week of March. So this was well before we got to the 12th or 13th of March here in the US and started to actually see states begin to shut things down. So you can see this very sharp leftward move in the amount of mass or in how respondents are seeing forward-looking inflation over the year ahead. So it was centered on 2%, and a large share of firms were there from January to March. It's still centered on that 2%, but you can see that huge move of mass into the lower left-hand portion of this distribution. So, and we want to dig into maybe why is that the case? Why are firms seeing the coronavirus pandemic as shifting inflation expectations lower? And I think, first and foremost, this has to do with the impact that coronavirus has had on their sales revenues. So this is a contemporaneous measure, and this is a quarterly question that we asked, and it asks in a quantitative way, just are your sales higher, lower, or about the same as they would normally be? And then if a respondent says higher, we have a follow-up that says by what percentage amount? So by how much? Higher and lower. And here you can see that the typical respondent in the April survey in the second quarter saw a dramatic decline in sales relative to sort of normal amounts. So we're getting a gap here of about 32%. Historically, this quantitative measure of the sales gap is fairly highly correlated with the Congressional Budget Office's output gap, at least until about 2018 or so, when firms saw things softening a bit. And I think what we had in the CBO, even though that has yet to be revised, but it crawled up a bit above zero. And here on the right-hand panel, it's just looking at how stark that sort of shift from January to April was in a firm's in their sales gap estimates. And you can see for small firms in particular, those 1 to 99 employees, they felt the impact rather severely. We also have a set of special questions to sort of gauge in maybe a Likert type scale how significant these impacts have been, not only to sales activity, but also to business operations. So you can think about being able to get your workforce working from home or from alternative locations, or engaging in social distancing in the office. So we're looking at business operations. We're looking at disruption to supply chain as well. Here, those are those light blue bars. We asked the sort of Likert scale business operations and sales activity in April. We asked the supply chains as more of a follow-up in May. But what you can see here, and what this left-hand side picture is telling us, that quite a few firms, the overwhelming majority of firms, saw the hit to sales activity as either significant or severe. And a typical firm, the majority of firms here, viewed the hit to supply chains as being somewhat less significant or severe, in fact, more moderate. On the right-hand side, this is just looking at cutting the quantitative sales gap responses by their level of disruption. And this is really just to point out that those correlations sort of make sense most highly with sales. So you can see that firms that say they had no negative disruption from the coronavirus impact on sales activity actually have responded to that quarterly question that their quantitative sales gaps have increased a bit. And then that sort of moves monotonically down into the severe range as far as the mean quantitative sales gaps are concerned across the buckets. So we also asked a special question in April around the expected—
Excuse me, Brent, sorry for dropping
Yeah.
in. I think you should wrap up.
Oh, man. I got so excited, I'm sorry. So some inflation expectations, we're asking for price expectations here over the next 6 months, and we can see that those are cut, that folks are feeling the severe impact, have the most negative, are expecting to decrease prices over the next 6 months, and those that had no negative impact to sales activity are actually expected to increase prices over the next 6 months. Those in the none category happen to be the folks that you would think about, the grocers, construction, transportation. But on balance, on net, the sort of demand shock is winning out, and that's what I was going to attempt to show here and here. Is really even the folks that are seeing significant and severe supply chain disruption, almost all of them are also experiencing significant hit to demand as well. So, and when you're looking at, for those individuals that are getting the sort of double whammy of supply chain disruption and sales demand activity disruption, those individuals are expecting to lower their price. So that's why I say on net, the sort of demand shocks winning. And then last, I'll just say that long run inflation expectations are largely unchanged, maybe moved a little tick lower, but when you dig into the distribution, there's not a whole lot of movement there. And folks that have lowered their short run expectations haven't lowered their long run expectations in concert. So I'll close there and take any questions. Thank you.
Great. So any questions from panelists? So the question from audience is, Brand, can you break down firm expectation by industry? It'd be interesting to see what business expectations are in industries that are more aligned with consumer basket.
Yeah, and yeah, thank you very much for that. And yes, we can do that. Just wanted to save a bit of time here. We have actually in the past related their unit cost expectations to the sort of what's happening in each industry's PPIs in their producer price indexes. And we can show a very high correlation between our inflation expectations and what's happening in these individual industries. But yeah, I could create a final goods and services weighted measure that we could produce. So yeah, I can do that.
Great. Any other comments? Okay, thanks, Brent.
Thank you.
So our next speaker is Lina Drager from Lebanese University of Hanover. Lina, the floor is yours.
Hi. Thanks, Simon. Thanks, Simon and Laurent, for putting together this really interesting workshop and including our paper. So this is joint work with my co-authors Jun Bui, Bernd Hayo, and Zhang Mian. And we put together a new survey on households and their macro expectations, as well as consumer sentiment, assessment of their government, and other concerns, where we look at causal effects of information treatments about different aspects of the COVID-19 crisis. So this links nicely with the previous paper presented by Brent, who looks at firm expectations. So yeah, in the face of the ongoing pandemic, we think that this crisis presents a shock, an economic shock in several aspects. So we have an uncertainty shock, but we also have elements of a demand and supply shock. And we are not fully sure yet how households react to these different aspects or different shocks. And at the same time, when we look at countries' response to the crisis, we also see that governments differ in their reaction to the pandemic. So some countries impose lockdown measures very quickly, while in others that takes some more time. And then also, just by the pandemic itself, of course, there's this trade-off between the health risk from the virus directly and the economic costs coming from lockdown measures. And we're also interested in analyzing how households respond to those two aspects. So in order to evaluate these types of questions, we conducted an online survey in early May 2020 on households in Vietnam and Thailand, where we subjected random groups of the survey to information treatments about these different aspects of the pandemic, and then test for an effect on their macroeconomic expectations and spending measures, as well as the assessment of government policies and trust in the response of government to the crisis, and personal concerns related to the pandemic. So one aspect which we want to focus on with our information treatments is this trade-off between positive health effects of lockdown policies and negative economic side effects. on the other hand. We have two different information treatments which focus on one aspect or the other aspect. And the idea is to test if there's a different effect of these treatments which highlight either the importance of health measures for preventing the spread of the disease, or the negative economic effects of the pandemic, and if that triggers households in different ways regarding their expectations for assessment and spending. And then, of course, the question, why do we want to study Thailand and Vietnam? Well, first of all, most of the ongoing research regarding the household expectations and the crisis has been taking place in industrialized countries, mainly the US so far. And we are now looking at two emerging economies from the same regions, which are, however, still quite different in certain aspects, mostly in political aspects. So there has been political unrest in Thailand since a military coup in 2014, whereas the situation in Vietnam is relatively stable. And also Thailand, even though it has a much smaller population, has seen significantly more COVID-19 cases in absolute numbers as well as per inhabitant. So another aspect of our study is to see if when we give information treatments which highlight the differences between the countries or which are more similar regarding the assessment of the government or the public reactions to the pandemic, do we see different effects on our variables of interest between the two countries. So recently there have been a number of papers published who look at similar aspects to our study. A lot of them focus on the US. So Carola Binder, for instance, has a paper based on her survey in early March, so just before the pandemic really hit the US. And in her survey, US consumers are most concerned about the economic effects of the pandemic, not so much the health risks. And she finds that consumers who are more concerned or who already have prior knowledge of the Fed's interest rate cuts tend to expect higher unemployment and higher inflation, so they're more pessimistic. And there's this co-movement between unemployment and inflation expectations, which we frequently find also in other studies, and which points towards a view of consumers that inflation is something bad, or in a bad situation you expect higher inflation. And then when treated with information about the Fed's interest rate cuts and conditional on updating, consumers then become more optimistic about the future situation. Then the paper by Korbion, Gorudnichenko, and Michael Weber is related to ours in that they also focus on some aspects of policy. And here they have this a large survey on US households in April 2020 and give them different types of information treatments, both about the severity of the pandemic and about monetary, fiscal, and health policies in the US. Overall, they find very little effects on macroeconomic expectations or planned spending from these treatments. What they argue is that the most plausible explanation for this might be that the information also gives a signal of a very bad economic situation, which is ongoing, and therefore the large packages and the large expansive impulses might have small multipliers due to these negative information effects. And then finally, the last paper on the US, which is related to our study, is by Fetzer and co-authors on perceptions and economic anxiety, again, from a very early survey when COVID cases started to increase in large numbers in the US. And here what the respondents find is They generally overestimate the danger coming from the virus in terms of contagiousness and mortality, which is also true in the Corbillon et al. Survey. And then when treated with information about the true contagiousness or mortality, which in this case on average would be good news, that significantly lowers the concerns which individuals have. And finally, from a very large survey, which inspired some of our information treatments, Fetzer and Coauthors, so about 10 different co-authors, conducted a large-scale survey in, between March and April, covering 58 countries and over 100,000 respondents, about their assessment of the governments as well as the public's response to the crisis, and in many cases found that respondents said the country's citizens or the government response was insufficient. So there was a lot of unhappiness or disagreement with political as well as public responses. And they show that in respondents who perceive such an insufficient response, this is associated with lower mental well-being, so that could lead to pessimism or even psychological illnesses. So before I come to our survey, let me just give you a very brief macro background on the situation in Thailand and Vietnam. These two countries are quite similar or have been quite similar in recent years, but Vietnam comes from a from a situation which in the recent past, for instance in 2008, experienced much higher inflation rates than nowadays. So they had inflation about 20% in 2008, whereas Thailand has been more stable for a longer time period. In the recent years, shown here, Thailand experienced some deflation in 2014-15, but then inflation rates stabilized around 1%, so relatively low, whereas Vietnam also had this period of low inflation at the same time as Thailand, but then inflation rates have fluctuated around 3 to 4%. But considering that inflation used to be very high back in 2008, this is quite stable from a Vietnamese perspective. Real GDP growth rates in Vietnam have been very high in recent years, around 5 to 7%, and they have fluctuated around 3 to 4% in Thailand. And then you can see that both countries in the first quarter of 2020 are severely affected by the COVID pandemic in terms of fall in real GDP as well as inflation in both cases. So Thailand is already in a recession here, and Vietnam also experienced a large drop in GDP. However, in terms of cases and death, the pandemic in both countries was really not that severe compared to what we experienced in Europe or in the US. In Vietnam, there were at the end of June, so 27th of June, we see only 355 cases and 0 deaths, and in Thailand, the number here is tenfold, but still only 58 deaths. And what we can also see is that the timing of our survey, which here is marked in red, took place early May, and this was when the first lockdown measures had started to be eased. So in Thailand, we were in the phase 1 of easing, which consists of 4 different phases, and here in Vietnam, coming from a national lockdown, which was moved to not lockdown only in certain regions. This was then lifted on the 22nd of April. So also here we were in a phase where lockdown measures were already passed. And that's important to keep in mind when we come to the results. All right. So let's come to our online survey. This was conducted by a company called Run System, where we had a survey in the week from May 4th to 10th, 2020, which the timing was almost exactly the same in the two countries, but we have a slightly larger sample in Vietnam. For Thailand, we have a second sample to check for robustness 1 week later, but we don't use that for this analysis here. Respondents could receive some points for participating in the survey, which can then be exchanged for certain types of gifts. And in order to make both samples representative, we construct population weights based on age, education, and the distinction between urban and rural areas. Okay, so here you can see the graphical, the graphs which we used in our first two information treatments, and they were accompanied by some text explaining the graphs. And both of these are based on the data of this large global Fetzer et al. Survey. Here the first survey shows the distribution of respondents across many different countries. We have the average here in the middle, who were asked to judge the response of their governments to the COVID-19 pandemic. And you could say that it's too little, that's the red bars, appropriate, the yellow bars, and then the orange bars would be too extreme or too much. And what we see is that Thailand is at the bottom of the distribution, showing the largest amount of respondents saying that the government responded too little, whereas Vietnam down here is at the top of the distribution, having the lowest fraction of respondents saying the government responded too little, and the largest fraction saying that the reaction was appropriate. So that shows a really strong distinction between the two countries. And of course, showing this information to respondents in our country gives a very different framing between the two countries. So in the Thai survey, this could be regarded as a negative signal, showing a large degree of disagreement with the government policies, whereas in the Vietnam case, it could be regarded as a positive signal. But then we have a different treatment here coming from the same survey, where we showed the share of respondents who said that the public reaction, so the reaction of the citizens to the pandemic, was insufficient. And we phrased this here differently by showing in both cases that Thailand or Vietnam are about in the middle of these three countries, where we have a lower share of respondents saying the reaction is insufficient in China, and a much higher share in India. So here we could expect that the treatment works similarly in the two countries. And then the third and fourth information treatment is about the trade-off between lockdown measures in terms of health outcomes and economic outcomes, where in the third treatment we provide a text from the ILO global unemployment forecast, highlighting the extreme increase in unemployment expected due to the pandemic. And this is here summarized graphically, where we have a low scenario with an increase of 5 million and a high scenario with an increase of 25 million, which would be larger than the increase experienced during the financial crisis of 2008-2009. And finally, the social distancing treatment gives some information on the expected number of people who are infected with and without social distancing measures, to show that when contact is reduced by 75%, the estimate of people infected after 30 days goes down from 406 to 2.5 people. And just to show you that we find the same difference in assessment of the government, regardless of this treatment, across our whole survey between Thailand and Vietnam. We asked exactly the same question, which was asked also in this global survey to assess the government's reaction to the COVID-19 crisis. And for Thailand, we find that the majority of respondents say the reaction was either somewhat or not insufficient or not at all sufficient, whereas in Vietnam, the overwhelming majority says that the reaction was appropriate. So evidently there's some disagreement regarding the government's reaction between the two countries. And in order to provide some background for the interpretation of our treatment effects, these are just some summary statistics from our survey. The first couple of columns are for Vietnam and then for Thailand. And the min and max values are the same for both surveys, of course. We asked inflation expectations, unemployment expectations, and GDP growth expectations on a qualitative 5 scale. And we see that on average, the inflation expectations are very similar in the two countries, but we have somewhat higher unemployment expectations and somewhat lower GDP growth expectations in Thailand compared to Vietnam. So they are more pessimistic regarding the real economic development. When we look at the assessment of the government policies with respect to the COVID crisis, as well as the trust that people have in the government in mitigating the pandemic itself, as well as the resulting recession, we see again on this 5 scale question that consumers in Thailand are much less trustful in the government in battling the pandemic or the recession, whereas the trust is much higher in Vietnam. And when we construct a dummy for those saying the response was appropriate of the government as opposed to insufficient or too extreme, we have a share of 85% of respondents in Vietnam saying it was appropriate, but only 30% in Thailand giving that same answer. So there's clearly a lot of distinction between the two countries in those regards. And this is also somewhat visible when we look at different spending measures. So we construct the consumer sentiment index in the same way as the Michigan survey constructs its index. We ask for qualitatively measured readiness to spend on durables, as well as we measure the marginal propensity to consume from a hypothetical question where households are told to imagine an unexpected increase in income of a monthly income. And here we see in general that consumers tend to say this is not such a great time to spend, and also the consumer index is not very high. However, it is lower in Thailand than it is in Vietnam, but the differences are not as large as the ones with regard to government assessment or trust. And the last couple of variables that we look at are concerns, individual concerns due to the COVID crisis regarding own health, job security, the personal household financial situation, and the economic situation in general, as well as life satisfaction, again, on qualitative scales. And here again, it seems that the difference between the countries are not that large, but we find that households in Thailand are somewhat more concerned regarding their own financial situation and the economic situation, as is the case in Vietnam, sorry. And also life satisfaction in Vietnam is somewhat higher on average. Okay, so given this background, and now we want to look at some treatment effects. So these are always marginal effects from ODA probits for answering in the highest category and controlling for demographic controls. Where first we checked for treatment effects against the control group, which did not receive any information treatments on inflation expectations in Vietnam and Thailand and unemployment expectations in Vietnam and Thailand. And generally we see no effects from our treatments except for this only marginally significant negative effect from the public reaction treatment here. This is somewhat different when we turn to GDP growth expectations. Here we find some effects in the case of Vietnam, where we see that the treatment which highlights the strong degree of agreement with the government reaction to the pandemic leads to a more optimistic GDP growth forecast, both when we ask directly about GDP growth and when we proxy this with a question about business conditions. Whereas the negatively framed ILO forecast treatment, which highlights the forecasted increase in unemployment on a global scale, leads to lower GDP growth forecast, both in terms of the next 12 months as well as the next 5 years. So that seems to make consumers in Vietnam more pessimistic, as it's clearly bad news. So here we have a kind of good news, bad news effect. When we look at the likelihood of saying the government's response to the pandemic was appropriate, as well as trust in the government to fight the pandemic or the resulting recession, again, we have only very little treatment effects, but we do find for Vietnam that households treated with the ILO forecast become more pessimistic regarding the assessment of the government, so they're less likely to view this as appropriate. Next, we look at spending. So here we have consumer sentiment, the readiness to spend on durables, as well as the measured marginal propensity to consume. And again, we find only very, very little treatment effects. There's this marginally significant positive effect on the ILO forecast in Thailand, which seems counterintuitive, but otherwise there are no effects here. And the last thing we're looking at is the personal concerns due to the COVID pandemic, as well as life satisfaction. Again, not a lot of treatment effects which are significant. There's one counterintuitive effect here on households in Thailand and who become less concerned with their financial situation when treated with the first treatment, which highlights the fact that many Thai respondents are dissatisfied with their government's response. And then interestingly, in the second treatment, which kind of is similar for the two countries and also provides, puts them in the middle between India on one hand and China on the other hand, respondents in this treatment are significantly more happy or satisfied with their life than in a control group. And this is the same in both countries. So that seems to be a good news again in terms of comparing them to these other large countries. So let me wrap up. What we have here is a new online survey on consumers in Thailand and Vietnam during the first easing of the lockdown measures, where we test for the effects of these treatment effects. And in a sense, we don't find a lot of effects either on inflation and unemployment expectations or in spending, which is similar to the results in the Corbion, Gornichenko, and Weber paper. But we do find some effects on GDP growth expectations in Vietnam, which tend to become higher when treated with the good news of relative agreement with their government's reaction, and lower when treated with information about high global forecasted unemployment. Spending effects are also almost not affected. This seems to imply that perhaps the effect of the lockdown measures were already incorporated at the time of our survey, seeing as this came after some lockdown measures were already eased. And then finally, the consumers in Vietnam tend to be more satisfied with their government policies than those in Thailand to a large degree. But when we treat them with negative information from the ILO forecast on unemployment, this is reduced. So again, this is a bad news effect. And the last effect, which I discussed, was this positive effect on life satisfaction in both countries when we give them a treatment which is relatively the same in the two countries and puts them in the middle. This could be kind of trigger some kind of optimism, seeing as they are better than one of the largest countries in Asia. What's also interesting is that we find no treatment effect at all from the social distancing treatment. So that seems to be old news at the time of our survey and does not affect expectations or spending anymore. So that's it. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay, thank you, Lina. So let me ask a question from the concerns and the emails I got. One of the audience asked, do the people in Vietnam feel the pressure to tell the truth? Especially when you talk about the result, about they are more satisfied with the government.
Yeah, that's also a question we have been asking ourselves, seeing as this high degree of agreement with the policies seems very overwhelming. And of course, we cannot be sure. What we know is that, of course, this was an anonymous online survey, and consumers knew that this was the case. But nevertheless, that could be a factor driving some of these difference, but most likely not all of it. And seeing that this was also exactly the same result which turned out in the other survey, that kind of at least implies that it could be something which is kind of more broad in the population.
Okay, is there any comments from the panelists? Okay, great. Many thanks to the speakers and the panelists for today's workshop. So we are done today. We'll come back tomorrow at 9 a.m. Eastern Time. So Lohong Fahaha will be the host.
Thank you, Simon.
Okay, bye, guys.
Looking forward to seeing you tomorrow. See you all tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Hi, thank you.